Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for being with us today. Mark Winter, Director of Agent Development with Macdonald Realty, here today with two of our great managing brokers, Bill Dick from the Vancouver region and Drew McLean from the Fraser Valley. Thanks for joining us, guys. We've had time to absorb the changes now that came to us on the 15th of June. And so what the three of us thought we'd do for our agents is a little bit about open houses and on some of the dialogues, some of the guiding principles and dialogues around open houses. So we've developed 5 scenarios to start with that can arise at any typical open house. And we'd like to look at how we can deal with these scenarios and the conversations that might follow. So the first one for you, Mr. Bill Dick, buyer comes to an open with our own agent present.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, this is probably the most straightforward one, the easiest one to negotiate. But there's actually 2 possibilities here. So first one is it's your listing or you're a designated agent on the listing. And really there are no issues with this one. If the buyer starts discussing personal info, then as the listing agent, you would be required to pass along this personal information to the seller in the event that the buyer writes an offer on the property. The second possibility is that you're a guest agent doing an open house, and therefore you're not the designated agent of the seller, and as a result, you don't owe any specific duty of full disclosure to the seller, and you would not have to inform them about any information that you might learn about the buyer while holding the open house.
Lovely. So that's pretty straightforward to start with. So second scenario for you, Drew. What about the buyer who comes in who is unrepresented?
Yeah, this is the one that has caused a little bit of concern for people, of course. You start by obviously asking, are you working with a realtor? And if the answer is no, I think a lot of people think, well, I'm not sure what I can and cannot say to this particular consumer or buyer. You can engage, you can relax, you can engage and just have a conversation with the person. You just can't offer advice. And so that's the line that gets drawn. You can provide factual information about the property itself. So certainly go through all the details of the property. You can share general information about the market conditions and things like that. You might use the terms of the Fraser Valley Board or the Greater Vancouver Board is reporting that. So you can frame the reference that you're using. So unless the unrepresented buyer starts asking questions about the seller, maybe their motivations or things like that, or they start sharing personal information about themselves, you can carry on that conversation. So what do we do if that happens? If that happens, it's obviously a great segue into having the discussion about the disclosure forms that you're required to provide to them. The 2 forms in these cases that we would work with is the acronym is a DORT, a Disclosure of Representation and Trading Services. So we go over that. And then the DRUP, the Disclosure of Risks to Unrepresented Parties. That's the other form that we'd have to go through with that particular person. Finally, there's that privacy notice and consent form, and that's a good time to introduce. If we're going to go through the forms, we might as well get them all done at that particular time. If they prefer representation, this is an opportunity for you to perhaps refer them to a colleague in your office. So again, great opportunity regardless.
Lovely. Thanks for that explanation. So question comes up here, Drew. There's 2 words there that stand out: opinion versus advice. What is really the difference?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there is some sort of graying in this particular discussion, I guess. An opinion, what I always like to say, it leads with sort of in my opinion, and advice says that I suggest. So you're making a sort of an actionable dialogue to them. I suggest you do this, or I suggest you do that. However, I caution people because opinions based on how you say it, how you frame it, can sometimes be misconstrued or taken as advice. And so I always suggest that the best practice when sharing your opinions, pardon me, is to share them with your clients. Avoid sharing opinions with unrepresented parties because, again, the caveat is that it could be misconstrued as that you're in fact giving them advice if they act on your opinions. So hope
Beautiful.
that clears it up.
That's awesome. Thank you. Number 3 for Bill. So a buyer comes into your open without an agent and you determine that they are represented.
Again, it's fairly straightforward, Mark. You can still present them with facts about the property and answer their questions about the property. However, if they're asking for comparable sales, listings, market information, even starting to go towards asking opinions, you should advise them to speak to their chosen real estate professional. If by chance the represented but unaccompanied buyer starts to give you too much personal information, then you as the listing realtor should pause the conversation and politely caution them about sharing personal information. You should say something like, any personal information you share with me, I'm obligated to disclose to my client, the seller.
Okay. So what if you are a guest realtor doing the open in this scenario?
Good question. As a guest realtor, Mark, you are not the designated agent for the seller, so you do not owe the duty of full disclosure to the seller. Best practice would be to remind the potential buyer that personal information should remain between themselves and their realtor.
Great. Thank you, Bill. So on to scenario number 4 for Drew McLean.
Mm-hmm.
A former client comes to your open.
Yeah, this again, I seem to be getting all the juicy ones here. Sorry, Bill. A former client. Yeah, I think a lot of people think, oh, red flags all over that, and to some degree, there is. I think we have to look at the time frame that has transpired from the time that they were, in fact, your former client. I think you have to look at how close the relationship was and things like that. But if they are, in fact, a former client, so this is someone that you transacted with, or maybe you were a buyer's agent for some time ago, and that transaction has long since taken place, then you can certainly offer or explain that as the listing agent, you represent the seller in this case, and despite the fact that you are my former client, I no longer have the ability to work under what was called a limited dual agency situation. So with that, you then have to have a simple discussion with that person and say, hey, look, I could either represent you as an unrepresented party, or alternatively, I can refer you to maybe one of my Macdonald Realty colleagues, if you will. And then, of course, if you are an unrepresented party, you'd go through the appropriate disclosure form, the DRUP disclosure form. If it's a referral, then that's quite simple. It's internal paperwork that you would send off to that agent, sending over the referral and your expected remuneration. And that's really all there is to it. You'd provide factual information to the party that's there, your former client, but you'd definitely stay away from any conversations about personal motivations or discussions of that nature.
Absolutely. Thank you. Number 5 of our 5 scenarios for you, Bill. A current client comes to your open.
Mark, this is, as Drew just mentioned in his previous answer, this is one that is giving our realtors a lot of concern. So the example here would be you're doing an open house on your own listing, and in walks a client, a buyer client, that you are currently actively working with, representing them. You're seeking properties for them to purchase. So now you're in a conflict of interest position. So the first scenario would be is if they don't want to buy this listing of yours, then great, there's no issue, and you can continue working with them, representing them to buy other properties. The second one is, assuming that they want to buy it, okay, this is where it gets into a conflict of interest situation. So you'd need to introduce that form known as the agreement of conflict of interest. And 2 possibilities would exist after the form has been presented to them. The buyer then would agree to sign it and would become the released client, and then you would continue to represent the seller as the continuing client. And if they agree to be the released client, you can then either do a transaction with them as an unrepresented party, or you can refer them to one of your great Macdonald Realty colleagues, and you could collect a referral fee.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, if they won't agree to sign the form, then you'll also have to give up the listing. However, there is some good news here. You could refer the buyer to one of your Macdonald Realty colleagues and the seller to a different Macdonald Realty colleague, and you could collect 2 referral fees.
Aha, very nice. Thank you, Bill.
You're welcome.
So now we've covered off some of those, what we'll call guiding principles. And as an objective of this quick session, let's narrow down the scope and language of the conversation that you as a licensed realtor can have to keep you in compliance. So we've developed a couple of scenarios with that as well. But please, cautionary note, the language we're using is what we choose to use. You can absolutely refine that to fit your own personality and your own style. But these are examples. So I've got 3 of these for you, quite simple. Firstly, for you, Drew, the buyer enters the open. So how can we actually engage them with these new rules?
Right. No, that's great. And I would suggest that the language that I'll share as well, just reiterating your point, Mark, is just language that we would suggest. You're going to need to hone this a little bit, make it your own, and make it feel natural as you deliver it. But yeah, I'm happy to go through it. So buyer comes to your, or potential buyer comes to your open house. You would obviously greet them as they came up to the door. You'd start with something like, "Hi, I'm Drew McLean, Macdonald Realty. Thank you very much for taking your time to stop by and come see my open house today. Would you like to tour the property on your own, or would you like me to take you through the property and show you some of the features and features and benefits of the home?" Again, your style, you deliver it in whichever way works for you. You might present them with a fact sheet about the property. So here's some information about the property attached to the sheet. You could include the explanation of the recent changes to our industry. Macdonald Realty has put together a very nice form that can be attached to your feature sheet, and you can have point some attention to that particular information piece. You'd ask them to maybe take a few moments to have a quick perusal of that. It's at this point that we'd have to start figuring out, obviously, if this is your listing, what you can and cannot do. So if it is your listing, in essence, you really can only offer agency to the seller, and therefore they have to understand the guidelines and principles that you have to follow. You can perhaps re-engage them at that point to confirm that they are either represented or unrepresented. You might say, "I'm curious, are you currently working with a professional realtor?" And if the buyer's answer is yes, then great segue into explaining, well, then I would assume that your realtor may have already had a chance to explain some of the changes, and you understand in our industry that as an agent for the seller, there are certain things that you may and may not want to say during your visit. However, you want to make sure that you put them at ease and not make them feel worried about that situation, just that you're happy to take them through the home or let them go through the home, and that you're happy to share information specific to the property. If the potential buyer says no at that point, they're not working with a realtor, then you might lead in with something like, "Okay, fine, just take your time, and I'm happy to answer questions for you that you may have about the property." Let them look around. Once they're finished, perhaps you can then say something like, "Is this a property that you could see yourselves writing an offer on?" If the potential buyer says, "Yes, I can actually see ourselves where we really quite like this property and it meets our needs," it's at that point then you can lay out the 3 different scenarios that you as a licensed realtor can provide to them. Those 3 scenarios, of course, are that you could explain to them that they could be an unrepresented party, and there's a disclosure that goes with that. Second option is that you might be able to refer them to a colleague in your office, as Bill and alluded to in his previous discussion. And thirdly, you could also offer that they're free to go find a realtor of their own choosing as well. So there's basically 3 options in that. If you ask them the question, is this property you can make an offer, and they say no, it's not of interest, and you know that they aren't represented, then you could say, well, it was great to meet you. If there's an opportunity to meet with you again and perhaps talk about what I can look after for you as your best interest as a buyer and as your designated agent, then I'd love that opportunity. Or you could say, fair enough, how about we meet after the open house and cover off your situation in more depth, and perhaps you can set down a time that would work conveniently for the both of you. So you've got a couple different options there anyways.
Beautiful. That's lovely. So that's the buyer entering the open.
Mm-hmm.
So we've done the open, and I noticed there it's not questions back like, is this what you're looking for? You know, there's really open questions, the what, where, when, why, etc. Sort of, we're staying away from that, right?
That's a great point, Mark. Yes, you don't want to get into those questions because, of course, they're very open-ended and could lead you in the direction of providing advice or something of that nature.
Great, thanks, Drew. Thank you. So on to number 2, Bill. You're a studious agent. You're a hardworking agent. You want to follow up. And you're making a post-open house call to a buyer who left their contact information. And as you make that call, it happens that they may have interest in the property. So that's our scenario. So how could that play out?
Sure, thank you, Mark. I'd give them a call and say, hi, it's Bill Dick calling from Macdonald Realty. Just wondering if you have any questions specifically about the house that you saw at 1234 Main Street last weekend. So the potential buyer could reply no. So then I might say, do you imagine this property might be the one that you're interested in writing an offer on? So they might say yes or maybe. And I would continue on by saying, the reason for me asking this is that if you are under the new real estate rules interested, I'm not able to represent you as a client. So if you don't mind, I'll ask again. Are you currently represented by a professional realtor? So they reply again, no. So then I would say, can I set out for you what your options are if you do want to make an offer? Buyer says, yes, that would be great. So then I would give them the 3 options that Drew just discussed, and here they are again. I would say you can choose to be unrepresented, but in that case, the buyer would need to agree to that and complete the appropriate forms. The second one would be I could refer them to a colleague who can represent your interests and write an offer. Or 3, you can choose to go out on your own and find a realtor of your choice who will write up an offer for you. By the way, have you heard about the changes in our industry, about the types of representation a realtor can provide? Potential buyer says yes or no. I would say, okay, so these new rules obligate me to send you a form which outlines exactly what we just discussed and what your options are. It is not a contract. It's to help buyers like you understand representation nice and early in the transaction. Can I get your email address, please? If no, then proceed to fill out the disclosure of representation and trading services and make a note in the client area that they refuse receipt of the document even though it was discussed. If yes, forward them the form.
Beautiful. Thanks for that, Bill.
You're welcome.
And then on to you, Drew, again. What if you're making a post-open house call to a buyer who left their contact info and they have no interest in the property? How could that sound?
Good question. Yeah. So obviously great practice to follow up once people have visited your open house and check in with them afterwards. So the situation might be you'd start off with the opening line of, hi, it's Drew McLean from Macdonald Realty, just following up on the house that you saw. So specifically the house you saw at 1234 Main Street. Do you have any questions regarding that particular property? And the buyer, potential buyer, might say no, and you'd say, okay, well, that's fine. Then you'd perhaps lead in with the next line, which might be, do you imagine that this property could be a property that you would like to make an offer on? If the potential buyer says, like as you mentioned, no, this really isn't what we're looking for, then you'd have to sort of switch gears a little bit and say, okay, fair enough. Have you thought about the services of a realtor? Have you thought about using a professional realtor to assist you in that process? If the potential buyer's answer is at that particular time, yes, we already have a realtor, then of course you're going to be courteous and wish them success, and hope that they find the property of their dreams at that point. But if the answer from the potential buyer is no, not yet, this is a great opportunity for you. As a realtor is working an open house, you might then say, well, you know what, I'd love an opportunity to meet with you again and talk about what I can look after for you as a designated agent and the duties that I would hold with you as my client. You could then lead in with, hey, when would be a great opportunity or a good opportunity for you to get together and discuss that, or would you discuss that? It's really an opportunity here to get belly to belly with people, and that's the positive side from the forums and the changes that we're seeing in this industry. The forums are complex; they do take a little bit of discussion and dialogue, and it can't always be done over the phone. So this is a great opportunity to suggest a meetup time. I think that's where we have to look at these changes and look at them in a very positive light. I think one thing that we often do with those follow-up calls is ask for feedback. We say, well, we're just trying to obtain some feedback. And I think feedback is a little too open-ended as well. And we caution to say best practice isn't to use those types of terminology like feedback or the terminology of what, where, when, and why, as we mentioned. So, I think specifically narrow it to the property itself and try and obtain that information and frame your questions that way rather than really open-ended. So
beautiful. Thank you, Drew. And I think just to round things off here, out of adversity comes opportunity, as you said. And there's some agents who are holding on to the thought that, wow, I used to be able to get business from an open house. Now it's so difficult with all these new forms. My sense of it is that there is actually still really good opportunity to build business through an open house. Bill, what are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely agree with you, Mark. There's great opportunity still here when you're doing an open house. Obviously, if a unrepresented buyer comes in and it's quite clear that they like the property and you confirm that they'd like to write an offer, you can sit down, go over the appropriate forms and prepare an offer at their direction, present the offer to the seller, and of course, there's business right away. If the buyer, though, doesn't like the particular property that you're holding the open house at, you can certainly engage in a conversation with them and ask them if you can offer your service to them to assist them in finding the property of their dreams.
Beautiful. Drew, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. Bill mentioned it very well again, and as did you in terms of looking at change in a positive light and rather than a negative light. I think often change is very difficult for people, and particularly when it's on the magnitude of what we just saw on June the 15th. But if we look at that change and implement it properly into our business practices, we can certainly make great use of it, and it will improve the level of professionalism out there in our industry. And I really urge people to look at it in that fashion and not in a sort of a make work or additional burden type of fashion. So look at it positively. I do believe open houses are still a very good area to certainly hone your skills as a realtor, to meet people, and to represent yourself in a very good, positive way.
Beautiful. So on that note, that's the end of our video. I'd like to personally thank both Bill Dick and Drew McLean, great managing brokers. We've got hundreds of realtors that trust you guys for advice. You dispense it on a daily basis, and everybody's so grateful for that. And we hope that some of the scenarios we presented today will help you with your open houses and that you've received some value from watching this. So thank you for taking the time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys. Best of luck to everyone out there.
Yes. Thanks, Mark and Drew. And yeah, good luck to everybody.
Great. Cheers.